Welcome guys, this is going to be an interesting dopamine series in 2 parts. In the first part we are going to look at some of the most common causes of low dopamine levels, and we are also going to look at some of the symptoms of low dopamine levels, as in what happens if your levels are too low, is it even possible to have a good life then, and so on. And then in part 2 we will of course look at some smart and interesting ways to raise your dopamine levels if you think you are having issues.
Disclaimer. This video is information only and it's not medical advice. If you need medical advice, please see your doctor. I am not a doctor. I'm just a guy who likes to read and learn a lot. And in my videos, I simply share what I have learned with the viewers of my videos.
Scandinavian Bob here, hi. This channel is all about reducing anxiety and discovering interesting self-improvement tricks in order to build a stronger self. So consider subscribing, click on the little bell icon, and let's get going. Let's start by looking at some of the most common symptoms of low dopamine levels. But before we begin, I need to point out that the brain is a complex organ where balance is the key. So some of these symptoms may actually be the same if dopamine is too high. This means you need to look at the big picture and you need to recognize several of the symptoms before drawing any conclusions, really. Okay, but let's start. Symptoms of low dopamine levels. Low energy. Inability to focus. You find it difficult to focus on one thing for a long time, for example, reading a book and so on. Anxiety and social anxiety. Now here, for example, watch out, because some people can also get anxiety from dopamine levels that are too high. So keep this in mind and let's keep going. Concentration problems, fatigue, a tendency to become easily addicted. And here too, this is also true for people with high levels of dopamine. So again, we can't draw any conclusions if just one symptom matches. Feelings of hopelessness, low self-esteem, feeling guilt-ridden, depression, lack of interest in life, tremors and muscle spasms, muscle cramps, low drive, trouble sleeping, and here again, too much dopamine can also lead to trouble sleeping. Poor memory, and now we are talking mostly short-term memory here. And lastly, perhaps the most important one, low motivation and drive. A lot of symptoms to consider right there, but again, the most common one is low motivation and drive. And listen up here, if you remember only one thing from this video, then it should be this. Dopamine is the very motivation and drive neurotransmitter. It is often wrongly called something like the pleasure molecule. Well, this is wrong. You see, dopamine is not really about pleasure. Even though dopamine release feels kind of good when it happens, dopamine is actually more about the anticipation of reward or pleasure. When we understand this, we also understand why it's the key player in motivation and drive. It's there to make us go after the reward. So that's why low levels of dopamine equals low motivation. We have basically no drive to go after the things that we know will lead to a reward later on. And with this in mind, you now also understand why the title of this video is Fix Low Dopamine and Win at Life. Because if we can get so much more motivation and drive and a stronger go after it attitude by rebalancing the brain, well, then needless to say, that is the core engine for achieving things in life. And so now some people say, we can achieve things without motivation. And you're right, it can be done by sheer self-discipline alone. In fact, we won't always have motivation and a strong drive, even if we have a healthy functioning dopamine system. But it will help us so much, as drive and motivation are such powerful allies. And we really want to have those two on our sides as we keep walking on the road to success in life. Because with more drive and energy, it gets so much easier and more fun as well. Alright, now, so check this out. In a study on rats where they depleted the rat brain of all dopamine, the rat would starve to death even if he had a plate of food just a few inches in front of him. This is because now he had zero motivation to go after the reward. Now he did eat the food if they put it directly in his mouth, and he even enjoyed it then because of other brain chemicals. But because his dopamine was totally gone, he lost all his motivation. Now don't worry, if you have low dopamine, your levels won't drop down to zero like they did to the rat here. But I told you about the study to drive home the point how dopamine really is the key player in motivation. Let's take a look at another common thing that happens for a lot of people with low dopamine levels, the tendency to become addicted. Now, because of the low mood and lack of interest in life, people with low dopamine often seek out things that give a temporary boost in dopamine, like alcohol, online adult entertainment, sugar, cigarettes, gambling, and so on. And now some of you say, but hey Bob, you just told us that low dopamine means no motivation. The rat didn't even go for food, right? Yeah, that's true. But the rat was depleted of all dopamine. Even if you have low levels, you still have some motivation. And your brain knows that those 3 donuts on the kitchen table will temporarily spike your dopamine. So it sees it as a cure. However, it is not a cure. Instead, those kind of behaviors are often a fast track to addiction. And addiction makes the reward center even more dopamine depleted over time. This is the cycle. We have low dopamine with little interest in life, so we go after short-term instant gratifications, and that gives us a temporary dopamine spike and a moment of pleasure with feelings like, hey, maybe life is worth something after all. And this is why we are at risk for developing an addiction. And if that happens, then the result will be even lower dopamine levels in the long run. Talk about a negative spiral here. And this is why I so often say to my viewers that they should be careful about using dopamine spiking behaviors as a coping strategy or as escapism, because it will often come back and bite you. So let's move on to the causes of low dopamine levels. Well, we just talked about perhaps the biggest one, addiction. If you have an addiction, you will suffer from low dopamine. Kind of ironic how the low dopamine brain goes after some instant gratification in order to spike the dopamine levels. But then in the end, the cure becomes the cause, or one of the causes, because the brain had low levels to begin with. But you need to know this, as I know many of you are addicted to online adult entertainment, for example. And don't expect to get rid of all those low dopamine symptoms if you don't stop fapping your brains out in front of the laptop. Often the low dopamine levels even lead to several addictions, precisely because the brain is so desperately looking for some fast way to quote-unquote fix the low levels, even though it isn't a permanently fix. So if you recognize yourself in this, be careful with instant gratification. You should also keep in mind that when you decide to quit an addiction, it will take time before the dopamine system rebalances, and many people will even feel worse a few weeks after quitting because of the withdrawals. But then the dopamine levels will slowly start to come back up after a few weeks, so be patient. Some other common causes of low dopamine levels are long-term stress, lack of sleep, a bad diet that gives you certain deficiencies, which I'm going to go into more detail about in part 2. Your genes. Some people are unfortunately just born with something called reward deficiency syndrome, but this does not mean that you should give up, because there are things you can do about it. Type 2 diabetes can lead to low dopamine levels, and even just constant sharp spikes and crashes in your blood sugar. Coffee. Now, coffee also increases dopamine levels, but in part 2 I will talk more about this. Depression. Now, depression causes low dopamine, and low dopamine causes depression. So it can be a bit tricky figuring out what came first here. But again, it's important that you know about it and try to take good care of yourself. A leaky gut and a bad digestive system. Alright, I hope this has been informative so far, and just with what we talked about today, I'm sure you already thought about a few things you can do to rebalance your dopamine system. However, we are going to talk about some really interesting and smart ways to raise your dopamine levels in video number 2. And so in order to not make this video too long, I will continue there. You can see part 2 on the screen right here. And if you can't see it yet, it just means I'm still working on it, and I will upload it in just a few days from now. So stay tuned and keep your eyes open. This is Scandinavian Bob signing out for today, and as always, I wish you all the best in your journey to become the strongest version of yourself. And remember, as Winston Churchill used to say, if you're going through hell, keep going.